Okay, so I'm
Actually,
going
sorry,
to,
Marissa, before you start, if there's more people coming in, would you be able to admit?
yes,
Okay, because yeah, I'm going to be sharing Kelsey's screen.
absolutely.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm going to get us started. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the first event in our Queering the Collection speaker series. We are so thrilled to have Kelsi Evans as our first speaker. I am Marissa Petru, Director of the Gilbo Center for Public History and Assistant Professor of History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. This series is organized in support of the university's new LGBTQ+ archive. Both of these projects have been generously funded by the American Library Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The title of this series was inspired by Emily Drabinski's article, Queering the Catalog, which is now standard reading in museum studies and public history courses. And this series of speakers will provide expert insight into archiving materials in queer history and culture, and how to apply queer theory to create more inclusive accessioning and cataloging systems, support inclusive research projects, and generally create more equitable experiences at institutions of collection. A few reminders, especially if you haven't been in a Zoom meeting for a little while. One, please keep your mics muted until the Q&A after the talk. Two, we have enabled the chat, so you can share questions there as well, which Kelsi will address during the Q&A. Three, this is a safe space, so please be your respectful selves. And four, the recording of this event will be made available on the Gilbo Center YouTube channel. Before we get started, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that UL Lafayette is on the land of the Attakapas Ishak, and we honor the Attakapas Ishak and the land with gratitude. We would also like to express our gratitude to elders, past, present, and future, of the dozens of other First Nations in Louisiana, including the Chitimacha, Tunakabalexi, Jina Band of Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, Pushada, Appaloosa, Kinesi and Kinesi Nade Band of Lipan Apache. We also honor the enslaved peoples of African descent who worked this land when it was part of the Mouton family's sugar plantation. This acknowledgement was created in consultation with elders and leaders of tribal nations and descendant communities. And now I will turn things over to my co-organizer, Zachary Stein, Head of Special Collections at UL's Dupre Library.
Thanks very much. Yeah, as Dr. Petru just said, I'm Zach Stein. I am the Head of Special Collections at Dupre Library, also at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Before I introduce Ms. Evans, I'm going to put a link in the chat. Once this talk is over, we invite you to just kind of give us your feedback. This is just a little survey about like how the talk was, what you thought of it, and this will help inform us on the next talks in this lecture series. So I put it in the chat now. I'll also put it in later, closer to the end, around the Q&A. Okay. So this is the first of our lecture series of the LGBTQ plus archive project, and tonight's speaker is Kelsi Evans. Ms. Evans is the director of the Dr. John P. Cecco Archives and Special Collections at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, California. She is also currently serving as interim co-executive director of the society. Prior to joining GLBT Historical Society, she worked on the AIDS History Project at the University of California, San Francisco Archives and Special Collections, and managed archival projects at the Fales Library of New York University, the Lowe Art Museum at the University of Miami, and the Foundation of Landscape Studies. Ms. Evans holds an MA in Archives and Public History from New York University and an MA in History from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is active in professional organizations, including the Society of California Archivists and the Society of American Archivists. And without further ado, actually, first I'm going to, hold on a second. I'm going to show her slide. Okay, everybody can see that. Everybody can see the slides, right? Oops. All right.
Yes.
Without further ado, I introduce Ms. Kelsi Evans.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here tonight. And thank you for hosting the slides there. You'll hear me call slide sort of throughout, just to indicate to move on. So thank you, Zach. So I appreciate you all taking the time. I know it's sort of late there tonight to learn more about our organization and dig into queer archiving with me. Slide. In tonight's talk, I'm going to introduce the GLBT Historical Society and our work. I'll showcase some material from our collections and online resources, and then we'll get into a few specific examples of how we are continuing to build relationships within the diverse LGBTQ community to expand our holdings and hopefully ensure that all queer people see a part of themselves in the archives. I'll also discuss descriptive practices for LGBTQ archival material. And then I'll wrap up with some ways that you can learn more and sort of stay engaged with the national network of queer archives. Slide. So what is the GLBT Historical Society? We were founded in 1985 in San Francisco, and our mission is to collect, preserve, and share the history of LGBTQ people and culture with a special focus on Northern California. We have two sites, a museum in the historic Queer Castro neighborhood and the Archives and Research Center in downtown San Francisco, sort of near the Tenderloin, which includes the transgender district. And this district is the first legally recognized transgender district in the world. We also have a lot of online offerings, including digital archival collections and digital exhibitions. Slide. In the archives, we house over 1,000 individual archival collections that occupy more than 4,000 linear feet of storage. Material in the archives includes personal papers, organizational records, audiovisual recordings, photographs, periodicals, works of art and artifacts, and various textiles. So a lot of different kinds of materials. As a queer archive, we think pretty broadly about what constitutes archival material. Sometimes the communities, activities, and lives that we're trying to document don't always leave a lot of paper-based records, but they may leave t-shirts and drag and pins and leather vests. So we try to incorporate into our archival practices this diversity of material and history making. And on the screen, you're seeing just sort of a small sampling of some of the items showcasing this diversity. Slide. Since our founding, we have been an independent nonprofit community archive, and our staff today consists of professional archivists, museum and development and administrative staff, but we started as a volunteer organization, literally in a living room. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the founding of the society and the factors that contributed to the creation of the organization. So as I said, we were founded in '85 in San Francisco. And there were really two major contributing factors. The first being the AIDS epidemic, and the second being the lack of collecting of LGBTQ material at major institutions and the attendant lack of trust with those institutions. Slide. So looking first at the AIDS epidemic, beginning in the early 1980s, when AIDS emerged in San Francisco and New York, the effects on the queer community were devastating. It's really hard to even illustrate the enormity of the trauma. People were dying, sometimes very young, and the community was combating illness alongside political apathy and tremendous fear and often cruelty from institutions ostensibly designed to help, including some of the medical establishment. So in the face of all of this, you have this incredible resilience within the queer community as folks find ways to care for each other and demand action and change. The founders of the Historical Society in the 1980s are a part of this community that's living through this epidemic, and they identify a need that they want to address. They want to ensure that there is a trusted place within the community for the records of the lives that are being lost. As I said, folks were dying sometimes young, often without wills, and sometimes estranged from blood relatives, who would be the sort of legal next of kin. These blood relatives, if they were around, sometimes didn't understand the significance of what was being left behind, or they actively wanted to destroy those records. So the early collecting of the Historical Society was very much interwoven with this community effort to save queer historical material before it was lost or erased. Slide. The second major factor in the founding was the lack of collecting of LGBTQ material at universities and other institutions, and the attendant lack of trust with those institutions. So many of the founding members and early members of the GLBT Historical Society were community historians, both professional academics and sort of community keepers. Prior to the official founding of the organization in 85, these folks had been meeting to collect, share, and discuss queer historical material. These meetings provided a space for open discussion about queer history, and they offered access to vital primary resources to facilitate continued historical work. At this time, within major governmental and academic repositories, collecting scopes rarely explicitly focused on the collecting of LGBTQ material. Queer material was seen as unimportant or not grounded in a deep history. It was too controversial, or it was excluded due to outright homophobia and anti-LGBTQ sentiment among the leaders of those institutions. So as a result of this, you see queer people, including folks with the GLBT Historical Society, organizing queer community archives to preserve and share the history on their own terms. And I want to note, sort of especially in the context of my invitation to speak here tonight at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, where you all are undertaking this new project to bolster the university's holdings of LGBTQ archives. Collecting of queer material within academic institutions and some state libraries and archives has obviously increased since the 1980s. I think today there is a lot that major institutions can learn from the decades of collecting that has gone on within queer community archives. And there are some great opportunities for partnerships between queer community archives and larger institutions looking to collaboratively document LGBTQ communities. Slide. So now to take some time to give you just a little idea of the sort of breadth and scope of our collections. I'll talk about how we manage collection development, and I'm going to highlight a few of our holdings. These are really just a taste of the over 1,000 collections that we house and the countless stories that we have to share. Our collecting scope is focused on LGBTQ historical material with a focus on Northern California. As a community archive, donations of materials come in from folks reaching out to us, and sometimes from us contacting organizations or individuals directly. And we're so lucky, and it's really gratifying to have a community that's really invested in documenting the queer past. We receive on average between 25 and 50 sort of unsolicited donation inquiries a month, just people reaching out to us. So it definitely keeps us busy reviewing material. A large part of my job is talking with potential donors, doing collection reviews, and managing the accessioning process. Slide. So now I'll get into some show and tell from our collections. I'm going to highlight several personal papers that we have. We'll start with the papers of Elsa Gidlow. She's recognized as writing the first book of openly lesbian poetry published in North America called On a Gray Thread, which was published in 1923. She was also the founder of the Druid Heights Artist Colony in Marin County, which is in Northern California. And she's just this great example of someone who was out and proud in the 1920s and throughout her life. Her collection is pretty extensive and includes some really amazing correspondence, writings, photographs, and other material. But one very special thing is the addition of On a Gray Thread that we have in the collection. This volume is a rare book made even rarer by the fact that it includes handwritten notations by Gidlow and some edits to the poems for later editions. This book is fascinating in part because it documents her process and thinking about her work even after its publication. On a Gray Thread is now in the public domain. So we've digitized an edition and it's online in our digital collections if you want to read the whole thing. I did for a book club recently and it was fun. Slide. I also wanted to highlight Jose Sarria's collection. Sarria was an opera singing drag star, World War II veteran, and political pioneer. He ran as an openly gay candidate for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1961 for the same seat that Harvey Milk would later win. He's also remembered as the founder of the Imperial Court System, which started as this sort of campy drag gay social club, and it's now grown into a network of nonprofit charitable organizations throughout the world. His collection is really rich. It includes amazing photos of mid-century drag culture, records related to his political activism, and really extensive documentation of imperial court activities throughout California, including in more rural areas where documentation of LGBTQ life is often less available, though the communities were definitely there and thriving. And if you want to learn more about Sarria, we've put together a primary source set. It's one of many primary source sets that we have that highlights related items from our digital collections, and links there on the slide. We have Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin's collection. They were co-founders of the Daughters of Bilitis in the 1950s, which is the first lesbian organization in the United States. They were marriage equality advocates, and they had a couple of high-profile weddings, sort of remarrying each other each time the laws changed. And overall, they were lesbian icons and leaders in numerous LGBTQ and women's groups throughout their lives. Their papers are incredibly extensive and offer a wealth of information about them personally, as well as the organizations of which they were a part and their research interests. And we've digitized a really significant portion of the papers through a partnership with Cengage, if you want to see more. Slide. We have Lou Sullivan's papers. Sullivan was a trans man and advocate for transgender people. He was one of the co-founders of the GLBT Historical Society, and he really had a deep understanding of the power of archives and history to impact contemporary queer lives. He kept detailed journals throughout his life, and he donated them to the society following his death. They remain some of our most requested and used materials, also some of our most emotionally resonant material. People often have a really strong reaction when they come to visit Sullivan's diaries. A book recently came out called We Both Laughed in Pleasure, which is an edited volume of the Sullivan diaries. We work closely with the editors, and I really recommend it if you're interested in a sort of first-person narrative of a trans pioneer and his life and activism. Slide. Last but certainly not least, we have Sylvester's collection. Sylvester was a beloved disco star and singer-songwriter. His hit You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, released in 1978, continues to be recognized as one of the greatest disco songs ever. He was a truly unique person and proudly sort of gender nonconforming before that term was really used. Prior to his death from AIDS in 1988, Sylvester spoke openly about his diagnosis and his experiences with the disease as a gay Black man, and he advocated for compassionate care of people with AIDS. Following his death, he bequeathed future royalties from his music to the AIDS organizations Project Open Hand and the AIDS Emergency Fund. His collection includes ephemera and photographs, along with some of his stunning stageware, which was created by designer Pat Campano, who also designed for the Supremes. Slide. So I've touched a little on our digital collection, sort of in talking about the personal papers, but I wanted to finish my show and tell by highlighting a digital collection that's often really valuable to researchers. And this is the Bay Area Reporter Archive. The BAR is an LGBTQ weekly newspaper established in 1971 in San Francisco. We fully digitized the paper's run from 1971 to 2005, and it's full text, keyword searchable. The remaining years, 2005 forward, are available digitally directly on the newspaper's website. As an example of the kinds of history you can dig out of the BAR, my colleague and I were recently giving a talk about Jewish LGBTQ history in the Bay Area. So we ran a search of the BAR digital collection and came up with lots of relevant articles, including a pretty special one entitled Gay Synagogue from November 1977. The article is basically an invitation for other gay and lesbian Jews to join a new community that they've established called Shahar Zahav. And as the authors say, they want a space where one can, quote, openly enjoy one's Jewishness and one's gayness, end quote. And they detail services, community activities, and holiday celebrations, along with their perspective on their faith and identity and its relationship to both the broader Jewish community and the queer community. Shahar Zahav is still an active synagogue, and it has grown into one of the most important LGBTQ Jewish institutions in the city. And this article really documents sort of this founding moment. It's these kind of articles that make the BAR such an invaluable resource for users. BAR articles can unlock doors to further research, and they document both major and sort of ephemeral moments. The full text keyword searchability of the digital collection makes finding content so much easier, I can say from experience, and it really facilitates deep research. Slide. So while we have all these amazing collections and resources, we're also aware of the gaps within our holdings, and we're continuously working on ways to collaboratively diversify our permanent collection, engage underrepresented groups, including queer BIPOC communities, transgender people, and lesbians, and better document the wide array of queer experience. I'm going to highlight two collecting projects that we've undertaken to hopefully better represent the Bay Area's diverse LGBTQ community. Slide. So the first collecting project is a partnership with the Lesbian Archives of Sonoma County. This group is an independent community archival group founded with the mission of documenting the involvement of lesbians and creating community for women in Sonoma County, beginning in the 1960s. And Sonoma County is it's a bit more rural area in Northern California. LASC and GLBTHS began their relationship in 2017 when the leaders of LASC decided that they wanted to find a partner archive to donate some of their material to. LASC had grown, and women involved with the group had entrusted their personal papers to the archive. Members recognized they didn't have the facilities or the staff to care for the material long-term and make it available to a broad research audience in the way that they wanted. This need brought them to GLBTHS. We were a repository that was sort of grounded in the community and shared a related mission. GLBTHS archival staff worked with LASC to build trust, including making site visits and talking through expectations on both ends. LASC ultimately decided to partner with GLBTHS as the official repository for LASC's archival material. We now have the Lesbian Archives of Sonoma County collection, and LASC continues to do their historical collecting and information sharing within the community. When they have a sort of critical mass of archival material, they work with GLBTHS archival staff to review content and make official additions to the collection at the society. My apologies if you're hearing a dog barking. That is my dog. He is okay. Most recently, LASC completed a multi-year project to record oral histories with women involved in the Sonoma County lesbian scene. These recordings, including group discussions and individual recordings, provide amazing documentation of first-person accounts of lesbian and women organizing. LASC donated these recordings and descriptive metadata in 2021, and we have dedicated GLBTHS staff time and digitization funds to preserving these audiovisual files and making them available online. And we plan to have that digital collection available in 2022. So I wanted to highlight this partnership for a couple of reasons. One, it illustrates the important historical work community archival projects can achieve. LASC members are integral to the community that they are seeking to document, and this connection and knowledge can result in really fruitful collecting. Two, for GLBTHS, this partnership allows us to better document the lives of lesbians in more rural communities by building on LASC expertise and community connections. This partnership, based on collaborative goals and collecting, serves a community need, and it helps us achieve our goals of diversifying the archives. Slide. The second collecting project is the Calle 16 and Beyond Archives project. This project really started with an exhibit at the museum, and it's grown from there. In 2019, community curators Tina Valentin Aguirre and Juan Antonio Fernandez mounted an exhibit titled Chosen Familias, LGBTQ Latinx Stories. Our community curators program invites folks to propose, curate, and help design temporary exhibits at the museum, using both personally loaned material and material from the archives. Community curators are paid for their labor, and it provides an opportunity for folks to share their stories according to their own vision in partnership with the Society's curators. Following the exhibit, GLBTHS staff met with the community curators to discuss the possible donation of material that had been loaned for the show to the archives. And this grew into a larger conversation led by Aguirre about Latinx collecting more broadly in the archives. So we did some planning and collaborating about mutual goals, and recently launched a larger Latinx collecting project called the Calle 16 and Beyond Archives Project. San Francisco's 16th Street, or Calle 16, has been a thriving corridor for LGBTQ Latinx people for years. Recently, like many places in the city, the neighborhoods on 16th have faced increasing rent and redevelopment, so the historic queer spaces that make up this unique area are at risk of being lost. The Calle 16 project aims to document the lives, businesses, and culture of 16th Street and other LGBTQ Latinx neighborhoods in San Francisco. This archival collecting project really relies on relationships of trust and community engagement that were started before an archival donation ask was ever made. Aguirre has been central in making connections and inviting non-Latinx archival staff, myself included, into community settings where we can hear from folks about what kind of history making they're interested in, how the archives might be of service to the community, and what they envision for an LGBTQ Latinx collecting project. While we have accessioned collections through this project into the archives, we're as equally focused on building relationships within the community and guiding our work based on the needs and timelines of the community. And I wanted to highlight this project because I think it illustrates the importance of archival organizations investing and participating in the communities they hope to better document before you move right into a kind of extractive collecting model. In archives, we talk a lot about trust, and when we're thinking about filling gaps in our collections and better documenting underrepresented groups in our archives, we need to remember that trust is built over time and through our actions. Organizations need to demonstrate in concrete ways to those communities that their needs are centered, their history is valued, and that they can play an active role as partners and collaborators in shaping how the archive collects, preserves, and shares their historical material. Slide. So in thinking about this theme of collaboration, I wanted to highlight one last sort of community outreach initiative that stems from our early days as a volunteer-based organization. And this is the Archives Working Group, or AWG. So the AWG consists of community volunteers who serve in an advisory capacity to the Director of Archives and Special Collections, me, and archive staff. The group is responsible for advising on archival policies, like the collection development policy, and participating in assigned archival projects, including some hands-on work like collection processing and working days in the archives. We look for members typically to have archival or historical or some other sort of relevant background, along with the desire to help shape the GLBT Historical Society's archival practices. With AWG members, we've recently developed a new workshop series to provide free archival skills training to the public. We know that there are so many folks out there interested in archives, perhaps building their own collection or working with their community to gather historical material, but they may not have formal training, or they may have specific questions about a project. I get a lot of these. Folks work for an organization, they're the archivists of the organization, and they sort of have a storage unit and don't know where to start. And so they're looking for skills training. We're hopeful that these workshops can leverage our skills as professional archivists and trained volunteers to provide a service to the public and to folks who we know are embedded in communities that are so central to preserving those histories. And hopefully this can also be a trust building project as well. Again, finding ways to invest in communities and provide resources and not just operate from sort of a collecting only basis. So folks can submit a form on our website to request specific workshops. And we're also designing sort of open events focused on common questions, like how to preserve my personal papers, digitize my material, et cetera. As a community archive, we see educational and outreach programs like this as central to our mission to provide archival services to the public. Slide. So changing gears a little bit, the last major topic I'm going to discuss today is descriptive practices for queer archives. We get asked a lot by researchers and other library and archival professionals about how we decide how to describe historical LGBTQ collections, sort of what terminology is appropriate, are there descriptive best practices, et cetera. So this topic could really be like a whole talk in and of itself. We don't have time for that, but we'll try to share some of the basic tenets and tools that we use to structure our descriptive practices. So at the GLBT Historical Society, we see our work as archival professionals in a queer community archive as always grounded in empathy, mutual respect, and responsibility to the LGBTQ community that we are documenting and serving. We acknowledge that the language we use to describe archival records and the people and lives represented within them is not neutral. It's a series of decisions, and it directly shapes the historical record and the ways through which contemporary audiences engage with the material. Slide. There are several common challenges that come up when describing LGBTQ collections. One has to do with evolving terminology. So descriptive language for queer identities can evolve quickly over time. There are many terms that are historically significant and that were used by historical subjects to identify themselves, but that are now either not used by the community or that can even be considered offensive. A second challenge has to do with evolving identities. So it's common for queer people to identify differently throughout their lives. Folks might go by different names or different pronouns, which poses a sort of unique need in the description of such records. Third challenge is that widely used controlled vocabularies, like Library of Congress subject headings, are often inadequate when it comes to representing queer collections accurately and respectfully. Terminology within these controlled vocabularies can be woefully outdated, offensive, or privileged terms that are just not commonly used by the community, which can actually impede successful searching, especially among community researchers or folks that don't have a lot of research experience. And lastly, community-based standards for the description of LGBTQ archival materials are still being developed. So there are some really great resources out there, and we're going to talk about some of them that aid in this work, but there's not sort of one universally agreed to guide that covers all of the unique nuances required in the description of historic LGBTQ records. Slide. So what do we do? I'm going to talk about a few strategies we use at the Historical Society. First, we've developed our own style guide that includes a controlled vocabulary and kind of breakdown of common scenarios. For the vocabulary, we use Library of Congress subject heading terms whenever possible. But if those terms are outdated or otherwise unusable, local terms are substituted and a crosswalk is shown in the guide. In some cases, specific identity terms and terms relating to the queer community do not have authorized headings in the Library of Congress, so we use local terms there too. In developing all of our local terms and controlled vocabulary, we relied on a few different resources, including the GLAD Media Reference Guide, which is online and free, and it does a nice job of explaining why certain terms and language are preferred and why others should be avoided. We also used the Homosaurus, which is an international linked data vocabulary of LGBTQ terms. Again, it's online and free and searchable, and it's really extensive. So I think it's a good place to start if you're sort of have a term or have an idea that's represented in the collection and you're wanting to explore different term options and vocabulary options. Slide. So our current guide is really created with 4 main goals. We want to accurately represent our collections. Terms should be acceptable and in common use by communities. We want our subject terms and collection descriptions to aid in faceting, browsing, and online discoverability of material. And lastly, our descriptive practices should consider and respect the wants and needs of archival creators, subjects, contemporary users, and larger communities. Slide. So thinking back to those descriptive challenges that I spoke about, the style guide helps us in several of those areas. As a team, we established best practices for describing collections, and we built those into the guide. We looked at common scenarios and established sort of general guidelines to follow. For one example, we set out best practices for describing contemporary and historical identities in our collections relating to trans people. There have been many different terms used throughout history to describe trans identities, but in many cases, these terms have now fallen out of common use, and some could be considered offensive by contemporary users. As one example, Lou Sullivan, who I spoke about earlier, was very involved in what was then called the female to male or FTM community. The term FTM, while you'll still sometimes see it used by people very much within the community, it's not widely used today. It shouldn't be used by people outside of the community, and it is considered offensive by some trans people. So for our trans collections, we decided to use only the contemporary term transgender people as an umbrella subject term. We then used the catalog records description field or the finding aids notes fields to include other terms the historical actors may have used for themselves. This ensures that these terms are respected for their historical use by subjects and they are keyword searchable. But we can also provide ample context about these terms and their usage in a way that simply using them as sort of standalone subject terms would not allow. And it sometimes raises questions. Slide. We intend this style guide and controlled vocabulary to be a living document that may need to change as the language queer people and communities use to describe themselves evolves, or as, for instance, the Library of Congress subject headings evolve. I acknowledge that this goes against the sort of essence of controlled vocabularies, which are concerned with rigidity and fixedness. But ultimately, we want to center and prioritize our users, their ability to discover things within our collections, and our responsibility to not cause harm with our descriptive practices over what might be considered sort of standard best practice or most efficient in archival and library settings. We also make ourselves open to researcher input when it comes to subject terms and other descriptive practices. Researchers are in some cases subject and community experts, and we value their thoughts and opinions when it comes to description. We anticipate and acknowledge that subject terms and description on even newly created finding aids may become outdated over time. In anticipation of this, we include a note on all of our finding aids that states that the guide uses terminology for LGBTQ people that was in current use at the time of the finding aids creation, and that descriptive language for queer identities evolves quickly over time. It invites researchers to contact our staff with further questions or to provide feedback. I said earlier that descriptive practices are not neutral, and this note is an attempt to highlight for users the real people and decisions behind the collection description. So we're open to sharing our style guide and controlled vocabulary. Just reach out to me. If it can be helpful to your work, great. It's also a helpful way for us to get feedback on the decisions that we've made. This work can't be done in a vacuum, and it requires community engagement in order to succeed. Slide. So I'm going to start wrapping up. I wanted to end with ways to stay engaged with queer archives. If you want to learn more about our organization or explore our resources, please visit our website at glbthistory.org. You can browse our digital collections, view online exhibitions, watch past events, and search our collections. You can also become a member if you really want to support us. And thinking more broadly about the network of queer archives, we've created a list of major queer archives in the US. It's on our website, or you can reach out to me and I'll share it. I often share this with researchers who want to know the landscape better, and also with donors. If we're not a good fit for the material for whatever reason, it's a quick way for them to find other contacts of queer archives. The Society of American Archivists also has a really great resource called the Lavender Legacies Guide. And this is a really extensive online listing of even sort of smaller collections of queer material in institutions throughout the US and Canada. It's organized by state or province. So as you all start building your collections, if you're not already listed on that, I encourage you to sort of contact them and make sure that your collections are known there. It's a really great place to start if you're trying to find folks who might have LGBTQ historical material near you, or you're looking to make connections with other queer archives sort of in your region or state. Lastly, I just want to say that it is such an incredibly important time to be documenting and sharing LGBTQ history. States across the US are passing anti-LGBTQ legislation and attempting to limit teaching and learning related to queer history and contemporary LGBTQ lives. I encourage everyone to stay engaged and support the network of educators, museum professionals, librarians, archivists, and others who are working to make content freely and publicly available online and in person. It's really vital to ensure that this history is not erased and to provide people, especially young queer people, with access to the resources that they want and need. Slide. So with that, I'll close. Thank you all again for joining me and listening to my talk. I think we have time for discussion now, so I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'd love to hear from you all too about the work you're doing there. So. How do we want to manage questions? Do you want me to call on people, or Zach? Or
yeah, we'll call on.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can raise you do like a digital raised hand. Yeah, Sophie, go ahead.
Kelsi, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. Hearing what y'all are up to. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I work with the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project. So it's always so great to hear about other collections. And Kelsi, I have what I'm sure is going to be the most important question of the evening. So I'm so glad I got to go first. What is your dog's name?
Alan.
Okay, fantastic.
Alan the dog.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. I'll cede the floor to others now.
Oh yes, feel free to post questions in the chat, they say.
Clancy.
Yeah, I was so inspired by the story of this collection, and particularly the detail about how it started in a living room. And I was just wondering if you have advice for people who might want to start their own community archives. I mean, if we wanted to try to get one going here in Lafayette, yeah, I mean, it's pretty overwhelming to think about starting something like that, but yeah, any advice would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't around at 85 in the founding for this organization, but I can say that one thing we always encourage folks to do, because we have a lot of this going on in the community still, like we're a community archive in San Francisco, but there are tons of other community archives, even queer community archives going on in the Bay Area even, let alone nationally. So things to consider, I would say, when you start out is what kind of collecting you want to do. So do you want to collect foreign digital material? Do you want to collect physical papers, photographs, audiovisual recordings? What's your sort of goal and mission and collecting scope? Defining that even at the inception, even before you really start the project and know everything, can help guide decision making and help make it a little bit less overwhelming, I think, to start out. And you can make it clear to the community what you're doing and what you're not doing. Because it can just get muddled pretty quick. And I think that's where you end up with just, we've got a room full of things and we don't know what the through line is. So doing a little bit of time with if there is a leadership or if it's sort of a democratic process, whatever the organizational structure is, but to try to define those things at the outset can help. Next, you want to think about space if you're going to be a physical collecting organization, and digital space if you're going to be a digital collecting organization, and what those needs, costs, might be. Trying to, again, plan that out a little bit. And lastly, if you're going to be a collecting institution, again, thinking about mapping how you're going to preserve provenance information. It's something that I get a ton of, a group will say, we want to start the archive with you all, want to give you the collection. And they've done like really amazing oral histories. There's no consent forms. There's no documentation. It's not to say we can't take that material, we can't at all, but it makes it harder, right? And it makes it harder to make it available long-term. So things like deeds of gift, even if you just get a form from online or you ask me, I'll share ours with you. I'm very open to sharing all of our forms and documentation as best I can. But you want to record who's giving you what, when they gave it to you. Is there a consent? Is there an idea that they're giving it to that archive? So it's a lot of planning, planning out as much as you can is going to help avoid some of the hurdles down the road when you hopefully grow and get bigger as an archive. But that sort of defining, I think the most important thing, I think, is sort of defining your mission and what you're doing and what your goals are, because then that can build on grants, that can build into the community. You can do a lot once you have that sort of defined.
I have a friend who's an activist here locally, and he has it's been kind of his dream, because I'm not taking credit for this, it's his idea, to have like a Lafayette be a kind of have a sort of LGBTQ history of South kind of archival space. And so that's kind of the scope I think we were looking at. So yeah, this is super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great place. Geographic sort of scope is a great place to look. I would say also like look at the lands, those resources I gave, like the SAA guide and the guide we have about sort of national queer archives. I would also take a look at that and think about what's going on in the area already, because it's not to say you can't start your own community archive, but it's good people to know. that might be helpful.
Deborah, go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize. I was very late and I'm a bit heartsick about it, but what I did hear was super helpful and inspiring. And I am not an archivist, full disclosure. I'm a curator. And I guess I don't know exactly what I wanted to say related, but it is, I think, related because what I'm trying to do is work with established institutions. And for example, the museum that I work in, the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico is one such place, to use the collections that are already there, including the archive, and make the, I'll just use the term queer history visible, because of course, institutions like ours have been part of erasing queer history of many cultures. And I'm just doing that very ad hoc, just trying to get people, particularly who are not LGBTQ plus, IA plus identified, to take that responsibility on. So I just wanted to mention that, and as such, I mean, it's great to be with archivists who are so organized. Say that, so I have a couple efforts. I'm gonna put 2 links in the chat of things. Something I did a couple years ago relative to a museum I worked at, American History and Stonewall, the anniversary, because I give in there, you could, if you are interested to look through, I give a history of the resistance of the Smithsonian to talk about this history, at which they still have, not as strong as they did on the 25th anniversary, which is when I originally started working with that topic. But, and then, and something that I'm doing now at the museum I work in currently in New Mexico, and just wanted to say something about trying to spread the responsibility around and get established institutions to begin to record these histories and stories. And I don't know what you do with such established institutions, but we're trying to plan something for next year to start getting people in New Mexico motivated around doing that, and not just the queer community, but like people who work in heritage institutions. So I don't know if you consult with people to help us get people organized around these efforts. Because when I talk to people who don't identify as such about trying to do this history and looking into collections, they're very resistant, like, well, I don't know anything about it. And I wonder what you would I'll stop now, have to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, we do try to do partnerships and things. I'll say, like, broadly, our expertise is in sort of California, but the West. So do feel free to reach out to me and sort of detail more what your projects are, because I may know people or consultants or folks who can sort of be, especially, I come from the archives world. We have a whole museum world who might be more helpful for that. But just one thing you said that is, I think, interesting, larger institutions. When I said there wasn't explicit collecting of LGBTQ materials, I meant that, because it doesn't mean that queer content was not being collected and queer material and queer lives were not being documented. Whether they were being described as such, whether that information was being made public, there's a whole history there. So I do think larger institutions that think we don't have any LGBTQ content, that's probably wrong. You probably do.
Oh, yeah.
So just finding ways, if you are a person within an institution, even if you can't, or even if it doesn't make sense to start a new collecting project, but to reassess your existing holdings can even be a place to start, and might unearth some really interesting stuff. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There were some in the chat that came.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat. Thinking about shifting terminology, GLBT has generally in many contexts shifted to LGBT and then LGBTQ plus and continues to shift. Do y'all think of the name of the organization would ever shift to meet in response? And is this something y'all ever talk about?
All the time. We get asked this question all the time. So I'm currently serving as co-interim executive director, right? Which means we're doing, I'm not going to be the executive director, that's not my goal. So we're doing an external search for our executive director. But as part of that is this, and we've done public outreach around this and had surveys and things around a name change. Our organization's name has changed multiple times over the years. The GLBT it's an outgrowth of that evolution over time. And I think that there's a lot of support right now to continue that evolution. The name can be just raise all sorts of issues and concerns that are unintentional, I think, but that doesn't mean that they're any less real. And so yes, there is very much a conversation around a name change for the organization. We have a whole project right now, which I didn't even get into because again, I'm not the museum side of staff, but the major project we're working on is a much larger permanent space for the museum. The museum we have right now is really small. And as part of that is this sort of rebranding conversation around the name and representation. So yes, we get that question a lot. It's very valid. I am very much supportive of that conversation and discussion. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't know. I typed out that question because I didn't trust myself to be able to say it out loud.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that, and that's actually really interesting. You made that sort of quip earlier about shifting terminologies in terms of controlled vocabularies, and kind of how that's not really what some people would think controlled vocabularies are supposed to be doing. Where I'm happy to kick those people, but I think it's really interesting to think about your organization name change. I'm in Louisiana now, but before coming here, I worked for a substantial amount of time for an organization founded in the 1740s, which kept the same name, which is the American Philosophical Society, founded in Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And I think, right, all of those words meant something different in the 1740s. And and it really feels like really telling, right, that they don't want to change that name. They are not here, you know what I mean? They're not here to react to a changing society. Whereas those of us who are very concerned about being, responsible and reactive and respectful are always shifting. So I do appreciate to hear that y'all actually talk about the organizational name.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stay tuned. We'll see what happens in the coming years. I can't say for sure. but it's a conversation. There were links. Oh, you sent the links. Thank you. In the chat.
So I guess I'll start asking a question. So this was amazing. You answered a lot of questions I had. You answered questions I didn't have, but now I realize I should have had. So this is really fantastic. Just yesterday, Zach and I were talking about what kind of materials, and because I was, specifically concerned about, I don't want us to just be thinking about, flat records or just photographs and pamphlets, but really thinking about like three-dimensional artifacts. And because I also am coming more from the museums field. I was at NYU in the museum studies program, and so that was important for me for thinking about it, and also how I teach and who the different users might be. And that was a conversation Zach and I kind of started to have more. We knew we were going to collect artifacts from the outset, and then we started thinking, okay, but what kind of artifacts could we not collect? So, and space was sort of one of those things. So that's, I guess, a question. One question I would have for you is, like, how do you think in terms of preservation? I guess in a way it's a preservation question in terms of space, but also like, is an archive equipped to preserve certain kinds of things or not? And then, why don't we start with that that question? I have like 50.
No, I think absolutely, it's a question that comes up all the time, and it's something that I will say in our collection development policy has sort of like shifted over time. There were some points in the organization's history when there was more storage space and they were building out the museum came after the archives. The archives were the first program of the Historical Society, and then the museum came about, 12 years ago at this point or so, somewhere in there. So I think when the shift to, we have a museum space now, there was even more interest in collecting three-dimensional objects, things that have that sort of exhibit and display value in addition to the collecting. But I do think, like I said, as a queer archive, you have to take seriously collecting things that are not paper-based or photograph-based, just because of the nature of what gets created in the community. So we do a lot of thinking about space. One area we get asked to preserve a lot are signs, because there's actually this whole history about whether gay bars, lesbian bars had big neon flashing signage or not, whether they had open windows, clear windows that you could see into, or blacked out windows or not, and how that connects to different points in history and safety. So there is there's archival and there's research value there in sort of those, and there's this community love of those signs and what they meant. Some of them are the size of buildings. Some of them are made of neon that we don't know how to care for very well, or that, I don't have expertise in. There is an SF neon group, which helps us, which is great. So the ones I've inherited, we can keep, together. But sort of size, you have to take into consideration, like you do any other material, responsible and ethical care when you're taking on something to preserve. And if you don't have the resources, and that you don't have the space, you don't have the money, you don't have the staff expertise, and you can't get outside consultants to help with that, then I do think you have to question whether it's ethical to accept the piece, and try to find a different home for it. And we have that kind of conversation all the time. The archives working group that I mentioned is one of the groups that I rely on when I have a question like that. I'll say, we're getting offered just like a lot of leather from this group, and it's like, leather is going to need specialized care. There's different pieces. I need more context for this. I need to see if it's really something different than the other leather we already have in the collection. So I can rely on that group, who have people sort of embedded in the community in deeper ways than I am, to inform me of that and to help educate me. So I think finding those community connections is really, really important when you're dealing with sort of complex accessioning questions with stuff that you feel like is sort of outside your realm of normal, like, knowledge that you have in your head just as an archivist. We're relying on those communities to understand the research value of it, to understand the importance of it, and what story it tells that's different and unique. But yeah, and then again, trying to find staff. If you are in the luxurious position of sort of hiring staff to deal specifically with these collections, or you're hiring a project archivist, looking for a staff that has sort of a background that can cross those boundaries, and not somebody who's only sort of maybe worked their whole career just in paper-based collections, but has a little bit more training or a little bit more expertise in a broader array of material types can be helpful. Yeah, researchers can help you there too. Like, we try to keep research data on like what's being used, like obviously like what collections are being used and that kind of thing. But the way researchers use material culture and 3D objects and things to actually inform their research and create new work can also be a really good guidepost on sort of like what's where that value is that can then inform future collecting.
If I may.
Mm-hmm.
Those thoughts are very interesting, I think, and they bring me back to some of my questions, which are ill-formed, but because there are these growing specialized collections that feature queer history and stories. And my question is, because I think that across the board, cultural heritage institutions need to mine their collections of every sort for these histories. And maybe sort of the overflow of the type of objects you're talking about, for example, could go to such institutions like American History, which does have a specific LGBTQ plus collection, but it is relatively small. I don't know. And there are other such collections, but there's always the risk in getting such objects into and collections into museums of then that history getting lost when the museum ultimately doesn't prioritize knowing these histories. And I don't know, I just wonder what you or anyone in the group thinks about, like, you know, is it a pipe dream? You know, is it an impossible dream to think that larger, historically heteronormative institutions can take on this role? And is it a risk to try and advocate for that, knowing that that might fail?
It's something I always try to be really transparent with donors about. I mean, a lot of donors come to us because they want to donate to a community archive, an LGBTQ community archive, because of all the reasons we've talked about tonight. There's, you know, I've had people tell me my alma mater is X university, X state university, but I'm not going to give my queer life to that university because I don't trust what the state is doing. And I don't trust that it'll be preserved and made available. I think people share the concern around physical culture just the same as they do around, you know, donors don't really make, archivists make the differentiation in their head about material, and museum professionals do, but people don't when you talk to them necessarily. So for them, it's just the stuff that documents their lives or the organizations that matter to them. And so that conversation absolutely comes up. And some people, and again, if we can't take it, I try to direct people to other queer archives that can, or I try to be really transparent with them around what I do know of those larger institutions that they're considering donating to, and try to build on the network of folks who I know are doing this history, to reach out to with the questions. Again, just trying to be as transparent as you can with donors. I think that's what we owe to people and what we can try to provide. Sophia's saying.
Clancy, you got your hand up.
Yeah. I just a question that just kind of occurred to me. As an archivist, do you find yourself, because I do this, I'm not even an archivist, do you find yourself kind of like collecting or somehow tracking archives in real time? Like I bought some merch from Pete Buttigieg's campaign, and like, this is an archive, you know, this is an archival piece. And then also, I mean, I was thinking too, because tomorrow our town is having the second annual Pride celebration in downtown Lafayette. And it's a really, I mean, it's a pretty big deal because I mean, it's only happened once before, and the last year was pretty small, and this year we're gonna have 5 faith-based organizations, 4 churches, and then 1 like student, you know, campus ministry group, like who are, you know, open and affirming churches. And so, I mean, I was thinking about doing, I'm probably going to take a lot of photographs tomorrow, because I'm going to be there all day. And I don't know. I mean, I was just thinking, like, I'm creating archives. I don't know, this, I think about this kind of thing a lot.
You'll hear the term thrown around, like documenting the now. It's like a whole project. I don't want to take credit for that. But that idea of historical organizations doing contemporary collecting. So at a very base level, like university archivists think about this all the time, right? Like, you're a university archivist, your job is to sort of track the archives of the university. So you're doing born digital work, you know, you're sort of tracking so it's not uncommon in archives, in community archive settings and queer archive settings. I think it is a larger and more open question about, you know, we're gonna, you know, we'll be at Pride in San Francisco. Should we be like collecting all the things at Pride that we can get our hands on. No, that's just unreasonable. It's not going to be helpful to us. So what I try to do with contemporary collecting, a lot of our organizational records are with organizations that are still ongoing, right? And so we usually work with them on a schedule of donation, where it's after the records are sort of not active anymore, when they can be made publicly available, we'll collect. When it's things like flyers from an event, we have a huge ephemera collection that's sort of topically based. And so when folks want to bring in stuff from contemporary, from more contemporary events, I usually look at representation as a question and sort of, do we have documentation of this sort of event in the past? Can it be added to a file? Does it document something new? Like you're talking about this Pride celebration being fairly new, it's growing. That might warrant some new collecting in that area because it's something sort of new. So I think it's a tough question. I talk about it with my staff. I would like to say we had a better policy for it. We just honestly don't. Around contemporary collecting, we'll try to say sometimes sort of a 20-year gap between now and the past that we collect, but that's not firm. I would be lying if I said it was. So yeah, each archive is going to have a little bit different perspective on the collecting of the now that they're doing.
So if there are no other questions, we've run well over. Oh, there's a question. Nicole Beer.
Hi, Nicole Beer here. So I'm sorry I came in a little bit late. It's my daughter's birthday. I'm so happy to have been able to catch most of this. So I am an elementary school librarian here in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I wondered if you could if any of you knew of any queer collecting that and curating that is just around legal, right? Legalities over the years, legislation that has passed, just sort of the timelines of nuanced things, right? Not huge mountains like, same-sex marriage, not things like that. But for example, Nevada, we're one of 4 states where queer education in pre-K through 12 is mandatory. In addition to that, our school district last year doubled down, and this was sort of my life's work. As a member of the queer community, we got policy here in Las Vegas and Clark County School District, 5th largest school district in the country, 320,000 students, that also basically, not only do we have the law, but this is district policy in this district. So we're sort of double covered. And somebody needs to make note of that kind of progressive library collection policy and curriculum, in addition to all of the other crazy narratives on the other side. And I wondered if if any of you knew of anybody that or any campuses that specialize in that type of work.
So off the top of my head, no. I mean, most archives I'm thinking of don't have that specific of a collecting scope where it's just going to be like we're narrowly focused on the sort of legislative battles.
Okay.
Certainly within our archives, we have documentation of local fights, like the Briggs Initiative, which was a fight in California, San Francisco, around preventing or firing queer teachers, and it was defeated. It was a really big moment. It was sort of one of Harvey Milk's moments, so we have a lot of documentation of like that event, where again, the way you described, like you have sort of both sides of the issue. We've got pamphlets that are sort of pro-Briggs, anti-Briggs, so you sort of are seeing the different arguments that were floating around, but that's sort of part of our larger collecting scope, right? So I would imagine the sort of work you're talking about, I would look at, if there are queer, I'd have to go back and look at my list off the top of my head, but of queer archives in the area doing that work. If there's stuff at the state archives that are documenting at all, I don't know what the state archives are doing there. I'm sorry, my own ignorance, but yeah, I would think, I'd be curious what the other archivists on the call would think about that question. But for me, most collecting like that is going to be specific collections within a larger institution that's collecting more broadly of the state or the city or the area. Yeah. So, I mean, a similar California law is the FAIR Act in California, which is, all about education and including queer content along with a lot of other groups within that.
Yeah, do you have it as part of California revised statutes though? Is it district by district, just out of curiosity?
It is the statewide FAIR Act.
Okay, great.
I'm not,
Yeah,
I'm not an education specialist. Please do not hold me to this, but we have just, yeah, I think it's a state. I'm pretty sure it's statewide.
Yeah, it's not one of the 4 that I'm aware of when I looked at the list, but that's okay. That's okay. I can do some research into it. Okay, yeah, just curious. It's hard to block out the noise of all the negative stuff that's happening in schools right now. In terms of queerness and queer pride. And so, yeah, I wish that our institutions were doing something. We're not really known for our huge university system here in Nevada, but yeah, so that's interesting. Thank you for the comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I would reach out to our family coalition. There's other groups that are specifically about sort of education, and those are education professionals. Those are the people that are going to have a lot more up-to-date current information for K through 12, especially. I'm not an expert on K through 12 education side of things. It's very important though. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you so much to Kelsi Evans for joining us and teaching us so much this evening. Yes, thank you, Zach. Please fill out our survey so that we get some feedback on this event. We are going to have at least 2 more speaking events, if not more. We've been blessed with or worked hard to earn funding in order to have this speaker series in support of the new LGBTQ+ archive at Dupre Library. So have a great night, everyone. A recording of this will be made available I'm typing it in now, at the Gilbo Center website, as well as all of our various social media accounts and our Gilbo Center YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic evening.
And just to add one more thing, if you have any questions about this project, or anybody who wants to donate any materials related to the LGBT community, please contact either me or Dr. Petru, and I include our emails in the chat. All right. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Well, it cleared out. So yeah, we went